I've actually encountered a lot of Hebrew roots folks who are believers in Yeshua, who have told me that they started keeping Shabbat, and their families and their pastors told them, "You're going to hell now. You've fallen from grace, and you've put yourself under the law, and you've condemned yourself to eternal hellfire because you're keeping Shabbat." And so it's interesting the perspective you're bringing, that when Shaul says in Colossians 2:16. He says, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or the Sabbath." That what you're saying is that if somebody comes and tells you you're going to hell for keeping Shabbat, then you can't let them judge you. That's
right. And let no pagan, let no fool judge you.
That's pretty cool.
Because these are all shadows of good things to come.
Now, the way I was approaching this issue was really, I was dealing with all these people who were, really being, just so negative. There were these people who had these different calendars, and this is actually over the years, not just this year. Over the years, I've dealt with Hebrew roots folks, and it's interesting. I'll deal with rabbinical Jews and with Karaite Jews, and there really isn't this vast multiplication of calendars. There's the Hillel 2 calendar, and there are some disagreements among Karaites, but it's not like you go to the Hebrew roots world, and I've never seen so many calendars, and it's just unbelievable. There's
like a new one every month.
There's a lot of creativity. I think that's a very non-shimmy way of describing it. Very Davidic way of describing it generously. A lot of creativity out there. Well,
wild imagination was another way of putting it.
I didn't say that. Okay.
I did.
Okay. So anyway, so it started me thinking. So these people believe in the New Testament, the ones who are being so negative and vicious and they weren't just attacking me. They're attacking other people who are keeping Chag HaMatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in April because we didn't find Aviv in March, and they're slamming these people and attacking them.
You're going to hell.
And
I've heard them say that.
I haven't heard quite that, but I've heard some real just viciousness, and it got me thinking. In your Bible, it says in Colossians 2:16, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or a new moon or of Sabbath days." So how is it that they're the ones who are judging the other Hebrew roots people? I don't understand it. Isn't that in there? And it got me thinking. So, in what context did Paul say this? That's where it struck me. And I started thinking back to things that were going on in the first century, and it brought up another incident that happened around the same time as Paul wrote this. There's what we have, the incident of Rabbi Joshua. That was a very famous story. I talk about it in my book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. It's actually the most quoted passage from the Mishnah in Karaite literature, including my own book, you could say, because it's actually a fundamental concept in rabbinical Judaism, this idea of the story of Rabbi Joshua. What happened in the first century, they would begin the month with the sighting of the new moon. And the Mishnah in the Tractate of Rosh Hashanah, chapter 2, sections 8 through 10, it describes this incident that took place in Yavne around the year 80 or 90 AD, where Gamaliel II, the grandson of Shaul's teacher, who was Gamaliel the first. Gamaliel II is the head of the Sanhedrin, and these two witnesses come and they testify before the court of the Sanhedrin, and they say something. They say they've sighted the new moon, but it wasn't just enough to say, "I saw the new moon." You described what you saw. And Rabbi Joshua was sitting in the audience and heard what they described and knew they were lying. And this was a very big problem because this was the 7th month. This was what the rabbis call Tishrei. So it's the month with Yom Kippur. And
it starts out with the
Yom
Day of Trumpets.
Right? And so they were actually meeting for their court on the 3rd day of the month, which they normally do in the 7th month situation. They keep Yom Teruah for 2 days, and 3rd day they convene the court, listen to the witnesses. Rabbi Joshua knew the witnesses were lying and they hadn't really sighted the moon 2 days earlier. But Gamaliel II accepts their testimony and proclaims Yom Kippur based on that. So this put Rabbi Joshua in a very difficult situation. He said, well, I have to follow the truth. Doesn't matter what Gamaliel's proclaimed. And he decided to keep Yom Kippur, just him and his family, on the certain day, based on basically that if those two witnesses didn't sight the moon, it would be 1 day later than Gamaliel was observing it. So Gamaliel was going to keep Yom Kippur on a Tuesday night or whenever, and Rabbi Joshua was going to keep it on a Wednesday night. No big deal, 1 day difference, who cares? But Gamaliel heard about this, and he was the head of the Sanhedrin, and he was enraged, he was infuriated. He put out this order to Rabbi Joshua, and he said, "You must appear before me on the day of your Yom Kippur with your staff and your money purse in your hand, to show the whole world that you don't consider that day to be Yom Kippur, that you've accepted my decision and my authority." So this put Rabbi Joshua into a tailspin. He didn't know what to do. He was distraught. What does he do? On the one hand, he knows this is the day of Yom Kippur that God has proclaimed to the world by not letting the moon be visible to any witnesses who have come to testify. On the other hand, he has Rabbi Gamaliel, who is the head of the Sanhedrin, telling him, "Appear before me with your staff and money purse in your hand." Is he going to follow Gamaliel, or is he going to follow God? And it wasn't, to me, this would be a no-brainer. You follow God. It's interesting. I have a friend who was the president of 3 Messianic synagogues. This was his full-time job. And he was paid a decent amount of money for doing this, for managing these 3 synagogues. And the rabbi heard that he was observing the feasts according to the sighted moon instead of the Hillel calendar. And he said, "You have to choose your job or this calendar that you so love." And he says, "I'll give you time to think about it. I know this is your livelihood. You've got children, you've got their mouths to feed, and you've got a wife." And the man said to him, he said, "I don't need to think about it. I'm going to choose God's calendar." And he was fired, and he lost his job.
Wow,
and it took him time to find another job. It was no simple thing.
Well, that's a resume that heaven will go before him on.
Amen, Michael.
Yeah.
So Rabbi Joshua had the same dilemma as this Messianic friend of mine, but it wasn't obvious to him. He did need time to think about it. And he went and consulted rabbis. And he arrived at the doorstep of Rabbi Akiva, who is considered the greatest sage of the generation. This is the same Rabbi Akiva who years later would proclaim Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah, the false Messiah who was killed by the Romans in battle in the year 135, Simon Bar Kokhba. But this is before that happened, decades before it. And Rabbi Akiva hears Rabbi Joshua's dilemma, and he says, "Rabbi Joshua, if you stand against Gamaliel, you stand against all the court since Moses." And he explained Rabbi Gamaliel sitting as the in the seat of the Sanhedrin, as the head of the Sanhedrin, is in the seat of Moses. He's standing in place of Moses. If you defy him, you defy Moses himself. So even if he's wrong, you must obey him because he for you is like Moses. And he gave this teaching, which I talk about in my book, Shattered in the Conspiracy of Silence. I won't go into the details. It's fascinating because it shows you that the vowels were fixed already in the year 80 or 90 AD, because what Rabbi Akiva wanted to do was change the vowels on a certain word. And basically, he did change the vowels, but only for the purpose of interpretation. When we read it in synagogue, it's still the original vowels. And he said, for interpretation based on these new vowels, even if Rabbi Gamaliel is wrong, if Gamaliel II is wrong, you still have to obey him. And Joshua said, "Okay, I'm going to obey him," which just blows my mind. And this became a key concept, because what Akiva taught was that even if the rabbinical court, even the Sanhedrin, is accidentally wrong, intentionally wrong, or deceived, accidentally wrong, intentionally wrong or deceived. In other words, they mess up, they decide deliberately to twist the calendar, or someone's holding a spear to their head. For any of those reasons, you must obey their decision, even if we know it's factually wrong. It doesn't matter. Their decision is binding. And hundreds of years later, when Hillel II came along and said, we need to figure out a new system, the Romans have abolished the Sanhedrin, his system they knew was wrong. It was a calculation based on the astronomy of Ptolemy, the Greek astronomer, and it was wrong by a day or two every single month. Occasionally they get it right. Even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Accident.
You know, but it was this system that was guessing based on an average, conjunction, approximation, and they knew it was usually wrong, but it didn't matter because going back to the time of Joshua and Akiva, they knew that the Sanhedrin doesn't have to get it right because they have the authority to proclaim it even if they're wrong. So imagine, Joshua is dealing with this issue, Rabbi Joshua, whose name is Yehoshua. He's the Yeshua of the rabbis, submits to the authority of Gamaliel. And at the same time, Paul is sending his epistle to the Colossians, around the same time, within a few decades. He's sending this epistle to the Colossians, telling them, don't let any man judge you in matters of new moon. And it got me thinking, what would happen if you had a community that instead of doing what Rabbi Joshua did, which was submit to the authority of Gamaliel and the Sanhedrin, decided we're going to figure it out for ourselves, what would happen. And if I look at history, and we're totally honest and humble here, we have to admit that there's going to be lots of different opinions. You know, and we could make fun of people for having different calendars, different months, and storks and cyclamen and things like this. But the bottom line is these are people who are doing the best that they can with the resources they have to figure out God's truth. And in reality, we have imperfect people trying to figure out God's perfect truth. Sometimes they're going to disagree. And when it comes to the calendar, I can show you in history where there were Karaites, for example, who were in what's today Iraq, in Babylonia, who began the year with the vernal equinox. And why did they do that? That was the best that they could do. They couldn't get information from Israel about the Aviv. And the point is that when you have people trying to figure it out and they're not submitting to the authority of the Sanhedrin says, we know we're getting it wrong every month, but we don't care because we have the authority. But if people are trying to get it right, they may end up with lots of different calendars and different situations. And I wonder if that wasn't also happening. It's happened today. It happened in the Middle Ages with Karaite Jews. I wonder if that wasn't happening in Colossae with these disciples, these believers of Yeshua, who had decided we're not under the authority of the Sanhedrin anymore. And why would they decide that? This struck me when I interviewed, with my Hebrew Voices series, I interviewed the spokesman for the Sanhedrin. And he said something absolutely fascinating. He said, the role of the Sanhedrin isn't just to proclaim the beginning of the months, the sighting of the new moon or an approximate system. It's also to crown the King Messiah. In other words, when the Messiah comes, they believe it won't be that he says, I'm the Messiah and he'll be the Messiah. It will be that he'll appear before a valid Sanhedrin recognized by the entire Jewish people, and that Sanhedrin will approve and say, yes, you are the king, and put the crown on his head. It reminds me of the story of Napoleon. The story is Napoleon appeared before the Pope, and the Pope was supposed to put the crown on Napoleon's head as emperor, and he grabbed it from the hand of the Pope and put it on his own head to say, I don't need somebody else to crown me. Well, the rabbis believe in this sense they're kind of like the Pope. They're the one who puts the crown on the head of the Messiah, who will be the king. And it got me thinking, I remember I had this conversation years ago with my father of blessed memory, and I'd read all this literature of the anti-missionaries and the counter-missionaries. And look, one of my teachers, he was this Karaite guy, and he was training me to be a counter-missionary. That was his goal for me, his dream for me. He was a counter-missionary to convince the Christians to give up Jesus. And he wanted me to do that and follow in his footstep. And I was training and studying this stuff, and I just didn't feel it. I just didn't have I couldn't do it. I tried doing it, and I just didn't have the calling to do it. I would have these conversations, and I would say, you know what, we disagree, but wow, we've got some common ground. I would have these conversations with people. But anyway, I'd read all this literature of the counter-missionaries and the anti-missionaries trying to, disprove Jesus. And I went to my father, who was an Orthodox rabbi, and I said to him, so why is it you don't believe in Jesus? What's your main reason? And is it this verse or that prophecy? And he said, no, none of that's relevant. None of that matters at all. The only thing that matters is the Sanhedrin didn't proclaim him to be the Messiah. And if the Sanhedrin didn't proclaim him to be the Messiah, by definition, he's not the Messiah. End of story. Doesn't matter what Isaiah 7:14 says. Doesn't matter what Isaiah 53 says. Doesn't matter what Zechariah says.
And this is not a first-level rabbi.
Oh, my father is he had Yoreh, Yadin, Yadin, which is those 3 levels of rabbi. Nobody has the 3rd level today. They only did it in ancient times, but he has the 2nd level of ordination. And
is a lawyer. I mean,
he was a lawyer,
is his life.
And because he had the 2nd level of ordination as a rabbi, he was able to appear before rabbinical courts in Israel, which have legal binding decisions that they give out. He could function as one of those officials in the rabbinical court.
Okay. So his judgment on this is that, all these verses, what people are always arguing about. I mean, they had the big debates about whether he's the Messiah. Did
Doesn't
he fulfill
matter.
that?
It's completely irrelevant. He would say in hachinami, which means, this is we're talking about child's play. This is a clear answer. It's a clear answer, which is that the Sanhedrin didn't proclaim him Messiah, so he's not Messiah. Bottom line. And this is a clear core concept in rabbinical Judaism, in ancient Pharisaism. And it got me thinking, so the Sanhedrin didn't accept Yeshua as the Messiah. Now you're one of the disciples of Yeshua, and you're living in Colossae, and the messenger has arrived from Jerusalem and says, the Sanhedrin says that Tuesday night is the beginning of the Hebrew year. And maybe you're not bound by him anymore, by that messenger from the Sanhedrin. Because it's the very same Sanhedrin who didn't accept who you believe to be the Messiah as Messiah. And this is actually a really important concept. We've talked about this, Michael. I've talked about this with you. Then rabbinical Judaism, and I think of the Tanakh as well, you have this concept that there are certain commandments that are individual commandments, and there are certain commandments that are communal commandments by definition. And an example of a communal commandment would be we're commanded to wipe out the Amalekites. So no Jew in their right mind seeing an Amalekite walking by in the street would go and kill him, because it's understood that that's a communal commandment. The king of Israel has to form an army and lead that army against the Amalekites. That's the commandment. There's other things that are individual commandments. A tithe. I've got to pay my tithe. That's nothing to do with the community. That's my individual responsibility. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's an individual responsibility. So if you ask Pharisees and modern Orthodox Jews, they'll tell you the belief in the King Messiah is a communal commandment. There's no individual responsibility to believe in a Messiah. That is the role of the community, and specifically the Sanhedrin as the authoritative body of the community, to proclaim the Messiah king. And they'll say it's the same thing with God's calendar. You have no, and that was the point of the story of Rabbi Joshua, establishing this is not an individual responsibility. And in fact, you could say that was the shift. That up until Rabbi Joshua, people did think of it as an individual responsibility. Clearly, Rabbi Joshua thought of it that way. But the established rule that came out of Rabbi Akiva's reinterpretation and changing of vowels was, no, this is a communal responsibility, and even if the Sanhedrin gets it wrong, they're the ones who make the decision, and it's the decision for the community. And look, I'll meet people today who will say, how can I keep Yom Kippur on Tuesday night when all of Israel's keeping it on Monday night? Israel has decided, and I say, well, Israel doesn't make the decision. God does. That's my view, my perspective. I still take this as a Karaite Jew to be an individual responsibility. Even though if I saw an Amalekite walking down the street, I wouldn't kill him, because I still see that's a communal responsibility. But I see this calendar as an individual responsibility. I don't accept the ruling of Rabbi Joshua, and I have to wonder if in Colossae they accepted that. And maybe what happened in Colossae, and I wasn't there, I don't know, maybe what happened is they said, if we don't accept the Sanhedrin, we got to now figure the calendar out for ourselves. And maybe what happened then is the same thing that's happened throughout history, is they had multiple calendars. Maybe they had people who were saying, we're going to keep it based on, and I have no idea what it was, right? Who knows?
You could say, we're going to cite the new moon here.
In Colossae. And other people said, no, you can't cite it in Colossae, you have to cite it in Jerusalem. And other people said, well, but a messenger came over from Thessalonica, or whatever that place is called. They came over from Berea, and they cited the moon there. You know, we don't know because we weren't there. But I got to wonder if when he's teaching this, and Paul says, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or the new moon or the Sabbath, he's talking about the Pharisees who were in that community would say, you've sinned against God because you kept Yom Kippur on Tuesday night instead of Monday night. And the Sanhedrin proclaimed it to be, you know, on a certain night. And why do I think that? Well, you read the verse before in verse 8, but this goes on in verse 20. Let me read this. I'll read you the King James, the Authorized Version. Wherefore, if ye be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why as though living in the world are ye subject to ordinances? What are these ordinances? Touch not, taste not, handle not, which are all to perish with the using, after the commandments and doctrines of men. Now, most Christians take this to be, well, these were Greek, pagan, ascetic rules that people, maybe, but if he's writing to Jews, what does that have to do with Greek paganism? And it could have been Greek pagan things as well, but in the Jewish context, it's clear what this is talking about. The rabbis had all kinds of rules and regulations that the Torah says you're allowed to eat this, but we say you can't. The Torah says you're allowed to touch this, we say you can't touch it. The Torah says you're allowed to drink that, you're not allowed to drink it. You gave an example in a previous teaching we did here in this series about somebody who touched an open bottle of wine who wasn't Jewish. I want to share a story about that. So the rabbinical ruling of don't touch and don't drink, a lot of that has to do with wine. And the ruling is that if a Gentile touches an open bottle of wine or an open keg of wine, that wine is undrinkable, it's unkosher. So I have a friend, a guy from Hungary named Ferenc. He lived in Jerusalem many years now, he's back in Hungary. But when he was living in Jerusalem, he went to this family for a Passover Seder, even though he's not Jewish. They invited him to the Passover Seder. And during the Seder, you do the 4 cups of wine. And this was a large family. They had 5 bottles of wine on the table. And they were pouring the bottles, and he passed one of the bottles, and they said, we can't drink that bottle anymore. We have to spill it out because you're a Gentile and you touched the open bottle. He said, I set the table and I touched all the wine. They poured out 5 bottles of wine. This is what Paul is talking about these ordinances, touch not, taste not, handle not. We're going to pour out the wine if you touch it. Whole kegs of wine, which are all the parish after the commandments and doctrines of men. It's clear to me in a Jewish context, he's talking about these Pharisaic rules and regulations. And I think what Paul is saying is don't let those Pharisees judge you about when you keep the new moon and how you keep the Sabbath and what you eat and what you drink. Follow the commandments of God and don't worry what these men are saying. And look, I think that's, I could now say, well, if we figure out what the true meaning is based in the Tanakh, let's go judge everybody who's got it wrong. But I think Paul was saying something even more than that. Even within your community, he doesn't say let no Pharisee judge you. He says let no man judge you. And I think, my opinion, it seems to me what he was saying to the Jews in Colossae who were trying to keep the Torah is don't even judge each other. Maybe he's keeping the new moon on the wrong day. Maybe he's keeping it in the wrong month. Maybe he's doing something on Shabbat, which you've determined is forbidden. We have that in the Hebrew Roots movement. You got the Torah police. You got somebody who'll say, well, you're not allowed to do that on Shabbat, and the other guy will be doing it. It's like, whoa, slap the hand. You're not allowed to do that. Wait a minute, you're not my judge. And I think that's what Paul was talking about. I think it's a pretty powerful teaching if that's what he was teaching. This is coming against the spirit of Shimei, I think. The spirit of Shimei was alive there in Colossae saying, you guys aren't doing it right. We're going to judge you. We're going to condemn you because we have the truth. We are righteous. That's the vain deceit. I got to wonder if that's what he's talking about, Michael.
Well, I think it fits. It fits
I think
perfectly.
It does.
And we see its application in daily life right now. Okay, so we can see the application as let no pagan judge you. But now we take a look at the Torah police and even within our own body. And as it says, let no man judge you, and then it has the contrasting conjunction, but. Let no man of this particular, but the body of Messiah. The believers, we have to decide how we're going to do it because today nobody can keep Passover. I mean, that's just a given. We celebrate Passover, but on the Orthodox plate, the broken shank bone of a lamb, just to say, no, we did not sacrifice a lamb in the gates of our own city. That's only been done at Jerusalem, and we're not keeping Passover.
Michael, back on Shavuot, quite some time ago, I was speaking to this group in Detroit, and this woman in the audience, and that was Shavuot based on my understanding in the biblical calendar, and I'm always right. But you were keeping Shavuot a week later, and this one woman in the audience, as I was starting, said, tell us why Michael's wrong, take him down. And I said, no, don't you know what it says in your Bible, Colossians 2:16, let no man judge you in these matters? Why would I come to judge Michael? He's done the best he can based on his understanding. I've done the best I can based on my understanding. Why do you want me to be Shimei and attack somebody who's doing the best they can to live by the Torah? Does that honor the creator of the universe? And look, I'm convinced 100%, no question, I've got the calendar right. I really believe that. But for those who have different understandings, can we please come together and meet on common ground and not hit each other over the head with the Torah scroll or with the barley sheaf because you've understood it one way and I've understood it another way? That doesn't honor the name of our Heavenly Father, and that's what it should be about. Loving our neighbor and honoring our Heavenly Father and doing the best we can to serve Him. And that includes, I think, not judging people even when they don't agree with you.